Hi, Steve Hayes here, and welcome to Flexible Conversations. And I'm having what I hope is a really wonderful conversation because I've been so enjoying his book with Michael Muthukrishna, who is associate professor of economic psychology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a well-known cultural evolutionist with a very interesting background that touches on some of the folks who are likely to be listening, as you'll hear quickly. But Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for inviting me, Steve. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. I am too. And part of it, I have to say, you're going to be down in Buenos Aires at the World Conference of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science.
Sure
And
am.
a lot of those CBSers are likely to be looking at this. So that's a really good reason to get to Buenos Aires and spend some time with you. And
I will
uh,
be around. I will be around, and I'm looking forward to all those conversations.
super cool. Yeah, I thought a place that we might begin a little bit is so much of what you're doing touches on the dual inheritance theory, and uh, but it goes much deeper and it has interesting and odd angles, as I think people will see as we get into it. But for people who just have not been even exposed to that at all, could we just start with that of what is that?
Is
And
dual inheritance theory. Yeah.
yeah,
So, put simply, dual inheritance theory is this idea that humans are a new kind of animal that have a third source of information or a second source of inherited information. So most animals, when they make their decisions, or all animals when they make their decisions, make them on the basis of genetic instincts that they get from their parents. So, those genes predispose them to eat certain foods and avoid others, to attack certain animals and play with or be friendly with others, to go to certain areas and avoid others, nocturnal, diurnal, and so on. Um, and they also have a lifetime of experience. So they figure out where the food is, where the water is, where the predators are, where the prey are. Humans do that too. So we have some amount of instincts. We tend to prefer sweet foods over bitter foods, for example. Um, but a lot of our behavior is not governed by our genes or even what we directly learn over our lifetime, but by cultural information. So, in other words, to say it another way, we are the product of millions of years of genetic evolution, but also thousands of years of what we call cultural evolution and a short lifetime of experience. And that cultural software is norms. So, the fact that we clothe ourselves a certain way, that we eat 3 meals a day rather than five or two, that we wake up at a particular time, that we use things like money, and that we try to get jobs and so on. But that cultural stuff is actually a lot deeper than that. So, in the book, I go through examples of real things that are cultural, but we might think of as human because at this point they're ubiquitous. So, one example of that is numeracy. So, um, you know, our ancestors and some groups today count like this: one, two, three, many. And when we count, we tend to count on our fingers, just the way that I did then, or with stones. The word calculus comes from limestone. But stones and body parts, they don't have to be 10 fingers. They can be anything. They make the natural numbers after one obvious. So one, two, three, four. So you can get beyond that. You can start to count to any number. And we use, as I said, a decimal system because we have 10 fingers. There's nothing special about 10. It's a terrible number system, actually. I would much prefer 8 fingers or 16 because at least that maps back to decimal. Um, but it still makes zero difficult to understand because where is the zero part of your body? Or, zero stones means nothing, and nothing is, well, it's nothing. And so it took centuries to get to the concept of zero. And even once we got there, it took a long time, 17th or 18th century, really, to understand negative numbers and be able to teach them to children in a way that was understandable. And the shift that took place, the cultural shift that took place, was a movement away from objects or body parts to a number line, to movement and position. And so again, this was a cultural innovation that we could then acquire in our heads, and it gave us new mental abilities. It was like downloading a new app to our brains but it was acquired. It was invented culturally and it spread culturally. There are other examples of this, all the way down to kind of visual processing. Not all societies are susceptible to the same visual illusions, for example, or things like if P then Q reasoning. If you'll indulge me one more example,
Yeah.
Steve. So in the 1920s, this Russian psychologist Alexander Luria, I think your group might be familiar with him, right? He goes out to Uzbekistan and he is trying to understand this education revolution, sorry, that's taking place where schools are coming in. And he asks people who've gone to schools and people who haven't gone to schools questions, a variety of questions, but some of my favorites are if P then Q reasoning. So he says, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zemlya, it snows. What color are the bears there? Now you're thinking white. Your listeners are thinking white. My 6-year-old, I asked her just to make sure. She said white. But when he asked people with education in Uzbekistan, they said white as well. But when he asked people who hadn't gone to school, they said things like this. I've never been there. Is it brown? I've seen a brown bear once. Now, that might seem crazy to you. Obviously, humans are capable of P then Q reasoning, but your school, our schooling system trains you into thinking in a particular way. So the point here is that if you want to understand what makes humans so different to other animals, a starting point is the realization that a lot of our behavior, a lot of our cognition, a lot of our psychology, a lot of what makes us human is not in our hardware, it's not in our genes, it's in our societies, it's in our norms, it's in our culture. But that has co-evolved, what we call culture gene co-evolution, with our genes. So it's not that we're humans because we can speak because we had something to say. We had a corpus of knowledge worth transmitting. It's not that we're human because we have giant brains, is that we needed giant brains to store that accumulating knowledge that was starting to accumulate at a rate beyond the capabilities of any single member of our species. I've said a lot. Carry on, Steve.
You have, and it actually comes out of your background. I just want people to know that. I mean, you have a really interesting background of, you're here, School of Economics, but you also have a biology background. We have a psychology background, and I think everybody can see it right here in terms of how you're dancing among these different levels. And um, uh, so the issue of how these different levels, if that is that even the right metaphor? To use a metaphor of levels? Sometimes,
So yeah, sometimes I mean, so for example, we use ultimate and proximate explanations as levels of explanation. Otherwise, these are disciplines. I mean, I think of myself as not an interdisciplinary researcher, but as a non-disciplinary or undisciplined researcher. And like I have questions that I want to answer, like why are humans different to other animals? Why are societies, changing the way that they do? Are we headed to disaster or, utopia? And the answers are not found in a single discipline. They're not even found at the intersection. They're found with tools that come from different places to convincingly provide an explanation. That's what a theory of everyone is.
yeah, that is a whole bit of our cultural evolution that might be interesting to get into, probably not now, but why are the disciplines organized as they are? And sometimes
Right.
really as a kind of a island archipelago where it's very difficult to go from one island to the other.
Yep.
But the interrelationships here that you're talking about are fascinating, and the people who listen, as you know, spent a little bit of time with Michael orienting them to what he's likely to see at Worldcon, are people who are intervening with individuals and couples and organizations, different levels. And of course, each individual has these levels of complexity, at least, or maybe, in the sense of gene systems, a learning history, a cultural background, and a current context that will engage all of that. But I'm interested in how we can go from one to the other in a way that doesn't do violence to any of them. And maybe this, what was the phrase you're using of, yeah, of undisciplined, non-disciplined. I don't know if it sounds so great, but I don't, it plays well, and it plays well in the book of being open to move across all these different disciplines. Do you have thoughts about that? Let me give you a specific example. The cultural impact on learning systems. I mean, language evolved. It was what we're doing right now. The bird outside the window is doing. Our closest common ancestor is not doing it. Yeah, it looks like they can use signs and symbols, but they don't do what your 16-month-old baby does, which if they don't do, they don't develop normal language. And some
That's
of the
right.
people listening to this actually have some connection to that because of work that we've done on it. So my question is basically, how are we going to maintain this kind of holistic perspective that you have and to be able to get in there and if we're going to change it, understand it at the level that we know where to intervene in this complex system?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I think that's exactly what this kind of overarching theoretical framework gives you. It gives you constraints on the system and it tells you where to look. Because, if you do science without theory, it's wiggle switch science. You like you wiggle this and then you look to see what in the system changes, and you try this intervention and it seems to work here, and then you try it 3 months later and it doesn't work, or it works in this society, not another.
Yeah.
It's near impossible to do that. But once you have a framework that's correct, it's what Poincaré called, Henri Poincaré called, he said, science is made up of bricks, just, science is made up of facts, just as a house is made of bricks. But science is no more a pile of bricks. I'm messing this up. Science is no more a pile of facts than is a house a pile of bricks. What it requires is a kind of structure to put those facts into something that allows for explanation and prediction. Um, you know, so that's what I think is on offer here. So, I don't know if I want to stress that point anymore.
Yeah,
The period.
well, and you do that right out of the gate in your book because while people recognize kind of an evolutionary approach, or at least that it's coming, there's some instances that are unexpected, of energy, innovation, cooperation, and evolution last.
Yeah.
And that's a theoretical structure that then allows you to go in all these different domains, one after another. You even call them laws of life.
Yeah.
The word law in science is a pretty, you're really grabbing something. So you
Yeah.
want to walk through this theoretical structure so that we can, if that's the
Sure.
right
Yeah.
term for it, but
Yeah,
that's,
sure.
yeah,
So, in the book I call these laws of life. They are not, Newtonian laws, because honestly, biology and psychology are not a Newtonian system. They are messy biological systems, but I consider them to be, close to laws. They're like lenses upon which you can view the world. And so the law of energy is just to say that the overall ceiling on the biomass and complexity of what is achievable has a kind of energy ceiling. Energy is what animates matter and makes it life. And this law, if you like, that ultimately we're constrained by the amount of energy in the system. It goes back all the way to the beginning of life. So, the first, whatever it was that turned the first self-replicators into the first single cells, we don't know exactly what's going on. I suspect it was a kind of RNA world hypothesis. But that early life only had access to geothermal vents, the heat of the sun, and maybe gravitational energy if you want to count it, because the moon was closer to the earth and the tides were much larger as a result of that. So, this moon was sloshing the water over the land and dragging it back to the ocean, and you've got this heat. And on the basis of that, these whatever these organisms weren't able to really move around very much until they were able to store that energy. So it's kind of like the problem we have today with renewables. It's great when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. It's otherwise there's nothing you do with it because you can't store it. And so when energy was falling on the earth and and photosynthesis evolved, converting all of that energy into chemical form, then you could start to move at a kind of plant pace, if you like, right? You're able to store that energy. But this also opened up a new space of possibilities, which is the fourth law, the law of evolution, which is that evolution is always trying to find new ways to capture energy in order to make more of itself, right? So evade predators, find food, and so on. And so one major transition was, I'm not going to just use photosynthesis, the sun, convert it into ATP chemical form, and use these sugars to move at plant pace. I noticed that there are organisms out there that are storing that energy for me. They're like hoarders. So instead, I'm going to go and eat those other organisms. And at some point, some prokaryotic life ate some other prokaryotic life and let it continue to produce the ATP within it, which is the beginning of mitochondria, the beginning of eukaryotic life. And so then the same pattern happens. As long as the sun is falling on the system, this introduces, plant-based or, life that's based on photosynthesis. And then you get other life that says, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to eat, or, maybe you do some mixture of this. I'm going to eat these other animals. And then you get increased complexity growing from there. But ultimately, the ceiling is still the sun. If, for example, an asteroid hit the Earth like it did 65 million years ago and blots out the sun, those large animals are not going to be able to eat the herbivores who need to eat the plant matter and so on. Everything just shrinks. So that's kind of the law of energy, and I'll return to it in the human context. But the second law is the law of innovation, and it's innovation's inefficiency. And that is that in this kind of evolutionary competition, this fourth law, organisms are trying to do more with less. So if there is a mutation, an innovation that happens, technological or genetic or whatever, that allows you to do the same thing but more efficiently, it tends to get selected and spread. So in photosynthesis, for example, early photosynthesis was incredibly inefficient until it started to introduce, it started to produce oxygen. It involved oxygen in the process, right? And when this happened, photosynthesis, I think, was like an order of magnitude more efficient as a result of this process. And that actually resulted in the first extinction. So, we often think about oxygen as this like really good thing, like we breathe it, so it must be good, but it's corrosive. I think if there were aliens out there looking at us, they're like, do you know that they breathe oxygen? The thing that causes the rust, the thing that, why you take antioxidants is because oxygen is slowly killing you. Oxygen is what turns a banana brown. It turns your fruit brown, for example. It's corroding everything around you. And so there's a great oxygenation event, which wipes out most of the life on Earth, actually, because you're producing so much oxygen. So it's the opposite of the problem today. You're producing so much oxygen that and most life can't survive. And then eventually, as a result of that, life that depends and can use oxygen for this energy process begins to dominate. So that's an example of an innovation. I'll keep going. The third law is the law of cooperation. And so that is to say that these organisms are not working alone. Sometimes it pays to work with others. And that includes you. So you are not an individual. I mean, you are, but you're also an ecosystem. You are not only made of differentiated cell in this kind of complex multicellular organism, but also rely on DNA that's not yours, thanks to your microbiome, that if I were to remove it, you would die. You need that to digest food. And so you're cooperating at this high scale. And the law of cooperation, it's almost obvious and falls straight out of the cooperation literature, is to say that the level of cooperation is the level where the per cell, per individual returns are higher than they would be in a larger group or a smaller group. So for a human, if you're too big a human, you can't get enough calories to survive, that's no good. And if you're too small and you're constantly getting beaten up or eaten by tigers, that's not good either. So the optimal level, according to the law of cooperation, depends on your energetics and it depends on your innovations in technology. So those same laws, which apply in the biological world through energy budgets, and maybe ecologists could recognize some of what I'm saying, also apply to the human realm. So the reason that we live in the world, so let me go back a little. The first innovation for humans was fire. So this was a way for us to use the energy in dead wood, plant matter, and use it to pre-digest food so that it was more bioavailable to us. And in doing so, so there's a key concept called the energy return on investment. The amount of energy that we get back for the amount of energy we put in increases. And that was one of the key features of our species. So fire was probably something that we needed to transmit, which means language might be selected, culture can be selected, but also it means that we can shrink our guts. We can shrink our jaws because we don't have to sit there like a gorilla just chewing on leaves all day. And we can grow our brains with all of that extra energy. So we change the trade-off for ourselves. The next major evolution in energy was agriculture. So agriculture was actually a solar technology. So we moved from from hunting and gathering to harvesting and grinding, right? So instead of walking around wasting calories searching for, animals to hunt or where the berries and the nuts and the tubers are growing, you start to grow it yourself. So you concentrate the solar energy, you do it efficiently by the law of innovations and efficiency, but using this energy and you grow your populations as a result of this. And so the groups that practiced agriculture dominated against the groups that still practiced hunting and gathering. The harvesters and grinders beat the hunters and gatherers to the point where many hunter-gatherer groups today still live on the margins where agriculture is not suitable. So the thick rainforests and the deserts. The last major revolution in terms of these laws was the Industrial Revolution. And we are living in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution. So what we found in the ground was millions of years worth of stored sunlight. So peat turned to black rock that we call coal. Algae and zooplankton turned to oil and natural gas. And we burned those batteries that had been charging for millions of years through heat and pressure in these dense forms that's easily transportable and easily pumpable into your car and your airplanes. And we burned them in a matter of centuries. And on the back of that, as per these laws, we innovated. So we were able to do more with less. Like our lighting, for example. We used to, environmentalists used to say, turn off the light. Don't bother. LED lights are close to 100% efficient and it barely, if you take one flight, forget the lights. Most of our behaviors, because we've had these massive innovations in efficiency, it means that we're doing more with less. That's part of it. But there's limits on efficiency, right? Like once you get to 100% efficiency on lighting, that's it. There's no 120% efficiency. And so the innovations are harder and harder to find, but you need to keep expanding the energy, and that's kind of slowed down on us too. So I call this the space of the possible, the energy ceiling and the efficiency floor, and that's where cooperation happens. So, the story of colonialization is not unlike the story of agriculture, which is to say that there were groups around the world who, through competition in agriculture, were able to seek out other groups that were less productive. That happened first, but then the big shift was industrialization, where one tiny corner of an outpost of the former Roman Empire. Where Cicero writes to his friend Atticus and says, "Do not bother going to Britain. You're not going to find anyone trained in music or literature. I mean, honestly, maybe you'll get some slaves. That's it." They find, first off, they have innovations. For example, the guilds that emphasize that if you want to do trade, you have to be an honest person, you have to join this guild and so on. So they had all this kind of preconditions, but then they also had cheap and available coal. So the places that had the innovations but not the cheap and available energy, they didn't industrialize, or to the extent that Britain did. And the places that had the cheap and available coal but didn't have the innovative prerequisites, like the cooperative prerequisites, they didn't get it either. But when you combine those two, it created the largest empire the world had ever seen. And the story of colonialization is the story of the eukaryotes eating the prokaryotes. It's the story of the smaller, more cooperative, energy empowered civilization seeking out less cooperative, less energy dense civilizations and exploiting them effectively, and horrifically. This is not a good thing. But it's the reason that we're all, we're speaking, English across the Atlantic, even if I wasn't in England. Um, yeah. So that, it was this combination of energy, innovations, cooperation, and this evolutionary process, seeking out new solutions that has led to the world that we live in today. That lets you look at where we should be, you know, intervening.
And I love the system, and I just want to see if you named them one, two, three, four, and I think a lot of the audience might be thinking, well, actually, four in a way is one, because they would be thinking in terms of, well, variation, selection, retention, and context, and the context has to do with things like the energy return on investment. Culture has to do with things like multi-level selection. So is it important to you that it's in that sequence? Is it these laws, or is it all four put together?
Yeah.
And is it the case that the last one will, in some sense, make sense of all four, in the sense that these are all sort of aspects of how evolution can work if it's multi-level and multi-dimensional and contextually bound?
So the first thing to say, the order doesn't matter. These four laws work together to
Yeah.
create the system we find today. But the other thing to say is, the borders between disciplines are what you consider signal and what you consider noise. And when I talk to the evolutionary biologists, they're like, look, it's just evolution, right? Like, okay, fine, there's different energy constraints or whatever, but ultimately variation, transmission, selection. Then I talk to the energy guys, and they're just like, look, it's all energy. At the end of the day, fine, there's a system that's going on with, however things are being selected, but energy is the ultimate constraint. If you don't have enough of it, it doesn't matter. And then I talk to the economists, and they're like, who cares about energy? We have plenty of that. What matters is the innovations in efficiency and and technology that we can use to do more things, ultimately governed by, let's say, incentive systems. And then I might talk to the political scientists or the cultural evolution people that say it's cooperation. Ultimately, if you can cooperate and you incentivize cooperation, you can do more with less. That's ultimately why you can innovate more, and that's ultimately how you found all that energy. But it's the blindness of our disciplines that I think that cause you to see, oh, that stuff, let's just take it for granted. I want
Yeah,
to,
that
yeah,
makes sense to me. That's pretty cool. It may make a difference though in terms of intervention because a lot of the things, and you get it in part two of the book, that are extensions of a theoretical analysis, some of those have not been experimentally tested. You can give examples, and if you they're more history than they are experimental science than the way we normally think about it.
yeah,
And knowing where to intervene, and if you think of them of all four, that actually I think is kind of cool and it makes sense. But then you still have to pick
definitely, yeah,
where you come in. And so, I mean, take something like one that I'm a little surprised. Hey, I know you're spending some time with David Sloan Wilson, and I've got one of the books I wrote with him over my shoulder, and one of the people who sort of dragged multi-level selection out of the ash heap of evolutionary thinking. He wasn't the only one, but he was one important one. And you mention it. You I don't remember exactly if you use that phrase, but you go through it and talk about it in a way that an MLS person would recognize. But you don't actually loop back and say cooperation evolved because of multi-level selection, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, interestingly, and I actually like it, I like it a lot. The way that you're talking about it in terms of cooperation has to work for all the elements. It's you often talked about as has to be successful at this level, and you have to suppress everything else at the lower level.
yeah,
Uh, David Sloan Wilson sometimes talks that way. And I said, wait a minute, certainly in voluntary groups, human groups, when I start thinking, no, it has to work for everybody. Like, and then is it really true that like mitochondria wouldn't have made that deal if it was a bad deal? Do you know what I'm saying? And
I
you've
do.
got to go right into something you've already said, even on this discussion. So I've asked you a very sloppy question. Excuse me for this, but and
Yeah,
maybe not a question at all, but
no,
where
I get it.
things fit, like multi-level selection, and um, where would you take that?
Yeah, look, so there's different problems when it comes to, cultural group selection, multi-level selection. A rose by any other name smells just as sweet, you know. There's different considerations. One is transition problems. So you can get stuck in suboptimal equilibria. So, many countries around the world, people are, they have states that can't provision for them. And so they're forced to rely on their friends and family. But the trouble with that is that people who rely on their friends and family have obligations, and even when they become ministers and presidents, they still favor their friends and family, and we call that cronyism and or nepotism, right? And so, in other words, the system is self-sustaining, and if you were to suppress that tendency to favor your friends and family, you might then be able to transition them to a system where the state can provision for them, and there's a bit less of an emphasis on those familial and friend-based obligations. Says that. But the trouble is that, what we want is a stable system. And a stable system is stable under conditions of plenty and where there's alignment between the different incentives. So, tumors and bacteria are always there. They're trying to attack this higher scale of cooperation that is you. And when one of your cells goes rogue and says, I want to dominate, I want to live at the expense of Steve, that means that that cell is going to kill the larger organism. And that's more likely to happen when um like children, for example, if they have sufficient nutrition, can often survive disease, in the developing world. But if they don't, then those lower scales will dominate. And in the same way, they could be that like a civilization built on slavery could be highly economically dominant and might actually dominate over civilizations where, people are more equal. But the trouble is, those slaves might, apart from the morality of it, they might actually rebel, right? And so you have an unstable system. You have a system that's not aligned, where all of the parts of it are getting their share, based on the contributions or something. It's not set up that way. The mitochondria, in the same way, the mitochondria gets a fair deal in that it's producing energy and it gets the resources and it gets to live and you get to live and everybody's happy in the cell. right? But if it didn't, if it was an exploitive relationship, then it's vulnerable. So, yeah, you have to have you have to have selection at that right scale. In that sense, MLS is right, but there has to be alignment as well for the system to be stable, and that alignment moves around with energetics. So, in a large marketplace, so companies are cultural groups, and the size of the company, the optimal size of the company depends on the size of the market. So what I want is the smallest company that I can have. So I keep close to 100% of the equity, like a good percentage of the equity, but I still, in expectation, have a good shot at taking a good percentage of the market. And so, you can have a very large company and then it's too diluted. You can have a very small company and you won't succeed. And so, by the law of cooperation, there's a right size, but it depends on market conditions. If market conditions are weak, you need a smaller size company. You got to fire a bunch of people. If market conditions are great, you grow the company. Same thing with organisms, same things with our societies. And so, actually, the problem we face today is that because innovations have slowed down and the energy ceiling is kind of falling in on us. We still have plenty of energy. I just want to be very clear about that. But in 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000. 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100. 2010, 1 barrel of oil found you another five. So, the era of cheap fossil fuels is slowing down. And that's triggering in my mind people's zero sum beliefs. And the problem that I think is that we do have plenty of energy, enough energy to transition to the nuclear age or, renewables with batteries or fusion or whatever that next step is. We have it. But because we have this zero sumness, we have on this continent in Europe, we're seeing a rise of the right wing and populism that we haven't seen in a century, right? The United States is coming apart in part, like when you look at the whole system, it's in part because things like the financial crisis, which have their roots in the oil crisis, which is rooted in OPEC and the end of cheap oil and all this, you can kind of trace it back, lead to people having a worse life, having to rely on smaller scales of cooperation. And it doesn't have to be like worse in absolute terms. They might be better off, than they were in the 90s by some metric. But in relative terms, they feel that. And it triggers zero sum thinking, which means your loss is my gain, my loss is your gain, rather than you did something and I want to copy what you're doing. So that's where there's an intervention point for you. Finding, tipping people into positive sum mindsets to avoid a self-fulfilling reality where they believe that, others' benefit is their harm and them doing well is other people's harm. And so they either reduce their productivity, as in some societies with evil eye beliefs, or they choose to harm one another rather than help one another.
You
Does
know,
that make
uh,
sense?
the people you're talking to are so much dominated by psychology. They would probably be thinking about, well, what is the role of cognition, emotion, memory, etc. in this? Like, for culture to be able to evolve in a way that there's a win-win and it becomes stable, then it's just like a healthy marital relationship. There has to be a win-win for the persons who are part of that relationship. And understanding those things happens out of the cooperative level is really important while still maintaining the
Yeah.
focus on it. So I mean, just kind of give an example. If we were fostering greater cooperation that was maybe more in tune with what we need the world to do, let's say renewables, etc. Uh, if I can just say, I mean, my first book was called Environmental Problems, Behavioral Solutions. It's still in print because it was so far ahead of its time that to this day, it was like one book that's occurred. And I shouldn't do this, but if I'm proud of it, those monthly things you get that say, hey, last month you consumed this, and a year ago you consumed that. That was
Yeah.
my dissertation. It was the first test of it, and it reduces electricity use by about 3%. Big deal. It is a big deal when it's everywhere, which public
Yeah.
utilities commissions grabbed it and so forth. But I kind of left the field as a clinical psychologist. It was odd to do it anyway. When I realized that nobody's listening, nobody wants to do this. This is the Earth Day 50 years ago, and it's like, you can see what's coming. Well, now we're in a situation where, yeah, renewables, people said, I don't want to be cold and I don't want to have to, plug in. And it's so easy. But turns out I got to test it. It's a lot easier. Just plug in at home, or even if, but here's where I'm going. How are we going to go from here to there it kind of feels like there's something in the middle here
Yeah.
on how language, cognition, psychology, emotion, memory, etc., work, values, etc., that you'll see we're very focused on inside the CBS world. That is sometimes kind of seems to be missed at the evolutionary level because it's like, okay, and then language happened, and then it has some features. Yeah, but how did it happen? How do you make it happen when it's not happening?
Yeah.
We'll maybe get over into intelligence and we'll run into the same issue where, there are kids, for example, who don't have very good language and cognition. They don't have a normal sense of self, etc. But it turns out you can actually establish that if you understand where it came from in the first place. So it's a messy question I'm asking you, but here's what I'm asking. In order to have the parallel of like cooperation, including success of the units within it,
Hmm. Hmm.
when you think of the massive cultural changes that are now upon us,
Hmm.
because of large scale things that you write about.
Hmm.
And some of these cultural things have been set up, like the difference between England and Norway, and the things that are in your book. Read the book; it's really awesome. It has so many cool examples that'll just carry around in your head. What is the role of psychology in that? Of actually being able to change it?
Yeah.
And are we going to be able to get to some of these massive cultural changes
Yeah.
without, you mentioned right-wing pushback? Part of the pushback is I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll have some autocrat who's saying you don't have to. That's
Yeah.
a promise they
Yeah.
make. Make a deal. I will just run the whole system, but you don't have to change. It's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
but the rivers are still, I mean, the oceans will still be rising, dude. Those
Yeah.
islands will go underwater.
Yeah.
Have I asked you a question that makes any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, the thing is that our psychology does vary. We know this from the weird people problem. So, Western
Yeah,
educated, industrialized,
absolutely.
rich, and democratic societies around the world have different values. They have different susceptibility to visual illusions. They count, differently to my previous example. Um, but there's also, I have a paper on psychology as a historical science. The past is another country. Like we talk about the generation gap, but go back a few decades and it really is like an alien place. Like, grab someone from the 1940s and bring them here, 50s, bring them here, and they'll be like, the hell is happening? Like they'd forget the technology just socially and culturally and psychologically. They just wouldn't recognize it. The emphasis on mental health, the, acceptance of LGBT, like people's freedoms to live their lives. Like they would just be like, that what? I don't know,
Yeah.
So things vary over time. So we know that it's flexible, is what I'm saying. However, there are certain things um that are hard to move. Like you can move things around culturally, but they are genetic things, right? Like you can move things culturally, but they are genetic things. So, one example of this is like people need food, right? And we know that we can rewire our taste buds. People can learn to like broccoli and Brussels sprouts. People can even learn to like chili peppers, which literally evolved because they don't want mammals to eat them. They literally want you to feel like your tongue's on fire. And every other mammal, Paul Rosen has these experiments where he tries to get like pigs and dogs to eat them, and they're like, oh, and humans are like, I like the burn. Like, if I told you I was gonna give you something that you rub on your eyes or your arm and it felt like your arm was on fire, you'd be like, I'm gonna interview somebody else. But like, if I tell you let's go eat something, some people would be like, yeah, let's do that. So anyway, so it's very flexible. Um, but but some things you got to fight against harder. It's hard to learn to like chili peppers. You start at a young age typically. Um, it's hard to get people to like um uh bitter foods. Monogamy runs against things. We have a monogamish behavior, if you like, where the highest status males typically, we don't allow them to take more than one wife, but they often have monogamish behavior, right? Because monogamy is difficult to, it was a relatively recent innovation. Most societies are polygynous, but that creates problems, as I describe in the book. Um, so what am I talking about? What I'm talking, I feel like I'm giving you as bouncing around an answer as your question, which is to say that, I think certain solutions to what we face are kind of dangerous. So I think that, the messaging around degrowth, even the messaging around kind of cutting back was kind of necessary, but it's not one of the aspects of our psychology that makes a lot possible is that we can aspire and we have imagination and we can imagine a better world. You know, a little kid like Elon Musk grows up on sci-fi and he's like, I'm taking us to Mars. And you might have opinions about Elon and you might have opinions about the desire to go to Mars, but you can see the effect of aspirations. You can see the effect of imagination, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, you know, so then the question is, what future should we have people imagine? What do we want to encourage them, right? And I think there are missteps. Like, you know, we in the I wasn't around, just to be clear, but you know, in the 1970s, you know, we got people to imagine a future of less. We got people to imagine a future. They didn't want to bring children onto a planet that was burning down, right? I don't think those are aspirational futures that are good. You know, I think fertility is important, and I think that it would be nice, you know, Bill Gates, when he was, you know, when he was launching healthcare in Africa, people said to him, if you increase birth, if you save more lives, the birth rates are going to skyrocket and people are going to die. That was the I heard that messaging as a kid in the 90s, you
Yeah.
know, that was the messaging. But it turns out when people had more, when their kids were surviving, they adjusted their fertility behavior in the presence of contraception. And actually, if anything, they're going through the same demographic transition the rest of the world is, right? And so, in the same way, if we had more energy, if we had abundance through nuclear, through more solar and storage, through um, fusion, if we ever cracked it, I think people like to live in a world that is clean. I think they don't want to breathe bad air. I think they would like nature to be preserved. I think people will be sad if we lose the tigers or the elephants, right? And I think one of the challenges is that the countries that, uh, the countries that are often the countries that are able to preserve their environments are able to do so because they are living in abundance. Australia, you know, it can sure it's got environmental issues with mining and so on, but they're able to regenerate the barrier reef, right? Because they have abundance. Whereas if you're in a country where nature is kind of deadly to you anyway, and you do need to kind of wipe down a rainforest because you need food, that's a very different situation. So I guess what am I talking about? Aspirations should be aspirations of abundance, not of stagnation, not of cutting back, but of more in a way that is clean. How do we have more people on this planet live a better life without killing the very thing that sustains us?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it would make sense to the group listening here just because of the centrality of values. And unlike some, we don't have a list. We're not like, here are the virtues and some of the things, wings of positive psychology. I think I've made a big mistake because it runs right into the weird problem. Yeah, those are your values, dude. And, if you go
Everybody
to
wants that.
Native Americans in Canada, they have a values system that has like seven different aspects. It's hard to even understand. It's like, but if you don't start there, you come in with your, things that were imported into,
Yeah. To emphasize a point earlier, Steve, more energy and more abundance means more possibilities, and then it's hard to predict what happens. It's hard to predict where we could go, but it gives people choices. It gives them
yeah, that
opportunity.
prediction thing, because it's a complex system, you don't really necessarily know. But I want to come back to that prediction thing in a different way, because if people are reading your book and they're saying, okay, what are we going to do? And you have a bunch of things in part two as to what we're going to do. Looking at it from a psychological point of view and trying to create, for example, more psychologically flexible people who are able to be here, tolerate some distress, focus on what's important, get the feet moving around that, extend that to relationships, take care of your body, the end. I mean, it's pretty much, and if you look at all the randomized trials out there, that seems like that's how change happens when psychological change happens. But you got some things in here that I think people need to think about, and I would like to challenge you a little bit and see if I'm with you around just the whole issue of heritability, because I mean, energy is kind of a lockdown. Heritability can be sometimes used, especially in policy and so forth, in ways that said, no, you can't do that because, it's 80% due to your genes or whatever, with methodologies that sometimes I think raise real problems and with a level of understanding that is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
can easily lead almost upside
Yeah,
down
I
thinking.
agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
Just because you have wonderful examples in there, like the richer you are, the more heritable IQ is and things like that, where
Yeah.
you really help people understand how that issue works. Can you lay that out so that I can bring it back to this issue about
Yeah, of course, of course.
how we can best plan for change in
Yeah.
a complex system?
So, for people who want to read more apart from my book, I have this paper called The Cultural Evolution of Genetic Heritability in Behavior and Brain Science. Um, I think that heritability is probably the most misunderstood statistic on the planet. Um, when people hear that IQ is 50% heritable, they think something along the lines of, I get 50% from my parents and then 50% from the environment, or 50% from school, 50, something like that is what they're thinking. But actually, they're confusing heritability with inheritance. Right. So, and one example that I give people to kind of illustrate it is, what is the heritability of number of fingers? And people think, they're like 100%. It's got to be close to 100%. And if you are thinking that it's close to 100%, it's because you think of heritability as inheritance. The heritability of number of fingers is close to 0%. And the reason for that is that heritability is the degree to which you can predict the phenotypic variability, the variance. So how much variation there is in the thing you're trying to predict, in this case, number of fingers, based on the variation in the genetics, in the genotype, right? So the problem with heritability number of fingers is that almost all of us, 99% of us have genes for 10 fingers, with a few people with polydactylism, which means they have more fingers. More of that variation is not caused by polydactylism. In fact, many people, like, they chop, if you have an extra finger, you lose that finger at birth, like people get rid of it for you. And so most of that is actually caused by environmental or cultural or whatever. Like, people lose fingers, in other words, like an accident with the circular saw or something like that. And so as a result of that, the genes cannot predict it. It's not genes doing any of the prediction. It's, if anything, the environment. So let's map that back. So when we map that back to something like educational attainment or IQ or anything like that, when you hear that IQ is 50% heritable, 30%, 80%, whatever, that doesn't mean that um, it's inherited at the rate of 30, 50, or 80%. It tells you nothing about that, actually, as my example of fingers showed. Instead, what it tells you is, in some sense, the heritability is a good measure of how equal the environment is. So if you imagine a world in which we all had the same schooling, the same parents, the same resources, the same all of this stuff, then the only thing that's left to vary is genes and just randomness, right? So randomness, be it through development or just random luck. And so as a result of that, heritability would begin to approach 100%, right? So in other words, here's the irony: in a more equal world, heritability goes up. Whereas in a world where, it's down to luck, really, heritability goes down. So, I use the example of the Scar-Row effect, made famous by Eric Turkheimer, where he shows that heritability is higher among wealthy Americans, close to 80%, than it is among poor Americans, down to 20, 30%. And the reason for that is, the difference between, like, elite school A and elite school B is marginal. Whereas, if you're a poor American, sometimes it's where you live by chance, sometimes literal school lotteries to get into the good schools, you know? So it's chance. And so as a result of that, there isn't this good match between genetics, the genetic variation. And even if you do calculate it, it doesn't mean that it's those genes that are actually have anything to do with cognition or anything to do with educational attainment. They're just the ones that are correlated. And I don't need to say it. You can imagine all kinds of problems about why some genes are more correlated with educational attainment and IQ than are others. If you think about IQ as a cultural fact, like when you learn to count, right? Like in some sense, I just want to be very clear. I'm not saying that there are not genetic differences between people. Absolutely are. I'm not saying that prenatal environment doesn't matter, or it absolutely does. All of this stuff matters. Lead exposure, whether your mom was smoking, all of that stuff matters. But what I'm saying is that the Flynn effect, this rise in IQ test scores, is best explained because the world has become more complicated and complex. Our education systems have been delivering more. Even our TV shows have gotten more characters, more convoluted storylines. Our discourse, the way we talk to one another, has become more complex, right? And that culture has always been, it doesn't matter how powerful your computer is, you're gonna have a hard time doing accounting without Excel. That's software. I would take a 1999 computer with Excel than a MacBook that didn't have access to Google Sheets, Excel, or the equivalent. if I was doing that kind of work.
Can I chase this over into engineered cultural variability and give an example of heritability? If you take something like, let's say, crime statistics or something, and you say, oh, well, there's a clear kind of heritability factor there, and there is. And then somebody points out an unexpected thing that was usually invisible. Physical attractiveness correlates the single strongest demographic variable, even more than race and gender, with things like criminality and a bunch of other measures, just a shocking number, right? And but the social cultural environment, if you're pretty or ugly, is pretty similar. I mean, you ugly everywhere you go. You can, and even saying that, it was kind of a joke, is now politically incorrect. You shouldn't be saying that, Steve, because some people are not very physically attractive. Well, but this is manipulable. And back in the 50s and 60s, it was actually done. Randomized trials with physical, with plastic surgery with people in prisons to just see what happened. And what happened? A huge impact on everything other than drug-related crimes, on things like the likelihood of being arrested, how big of a sentence you're going to get, how long you stay in jail,
Huh.
and some upside down ones. How likely are you? It's just kind of funny. How likely are you to be in therapy, and how long do you last? Because there it's upside down. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
suddenly, if you're not very attractive, the
yeah,
therapist doesn't want to treat you very long, and you're cured, man. You're cured on the first session. Yeah, well, but think about this in terms of this issue of heritability. When we look at things like IQ or whatever,
yeah,
I'm over here with a theory of language and cognition that is actively being deployed. The entire state of Hawaii has a $40 million project to put the stuff that we developed, that I developed, actually, but the whole community
yeah,
into all of the special ed classes because there's some pretty good early randomized trials. You get big leaps forward in terms of IQ, for example, but also, the likelihood that you'll be on the spectrum, blah, 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 things like that. It's engineered cultural variability. Plastic surgery is engineered. So when you look at heritability or even inheritance, the way we do it with
hmm
twin studies, rooted together, rooted apart, you name it, what it doesn't account for is the extraordinary environments that we may be able to create, the innovations that we could create that are cultural, that may alter a process. So, yeah, identical twins look alike. Fraternal twins, not so much. But you remember in the early twin studies, they didn't even keep track of fraternal versus identical. That came later. So you'd have mixed gender, and you have all these genetic. Wait a minute, no, that means all gender bias is being loaded in under the G in the G plus E plus G times E, and that formula just doesn't work. That dog doesn't hunt. I gave a talk years ago in a University of California, San Diego, to a behavioral biology and sort of evolutionary biology group, and said it's all G times A, and they literally laughed. I was a guest giving a talk. They laughed out loud in my face. Like, it's ridiculous because it hardly ever comes out, and the formula's done the way it's done. Yeah, but what's actually going on the ground? So the question I have to you, and you think now as an interventionist, how do you know and what do you do when, as part of a complex system, you can engineer cultural evolution innovations? You can put them into the schools. You can teach people differently. You can do, and when you do, that whole complex system may change in ways that are not easy to predict, and maybe even around areas where the bell curve, that horrible, horrible, horrible book, but Dick Herrnstein, of all people, out of my tradition. What were you
oh
thinking?
yeah, his
Oh,
you know
he's a behavior analyst. Like, oh, Dick, why? It turns out there's a long link between behavior analysis and eugenics that goes all the way back to the beginning. Fortunately, Skinner wasn't one, but that's another story. I'm messing up the question again, but can you come back to it?
yeah.
It
So I mean, first off,
Where do we leave
I
heritability
yeah.
if innovation alters everything?
Right. So a few things. One is I haven't heard these like attractiveness studies, and they sound
Pretty
amazing.
cool.
And I'd like you to please send me those papers. That sounds
Also
really
do.
interesting. I mean, the other thing, of course, is like, attractiveness is not. So I can imagine two forces there. One is that people treat you very differently, and so that probably results in behavior. But also like, um, attractiveness is not arbitrary. So it could be that you were exposed to a poor environment where you didn't develop as symmetrically as nature would have intended because light exposure or of your mom was drinking or something, any number of things.
Yeah.
Um, so and that might have an effect on criminality. Like, so in a complex system, be it a light bulb, any complex thing, be it a car or a human, it's hard to make it work and it's easy to break it. So in that paper, The Cultural Evolution of Genetic Heritability, I distinguish between genes that make versus genes that break. It's easy to find genes that break things. In the same way that if I remove one wheel of a car, the whole thing falls apart. I just open up the engine and grab one thing randomly, the whole thing breaks. But genes that make a system, that's hard. Like there's 7 ways to, break down, let's say, a fluorescent light bulb, but to make it, many, many things. Yeah. So yeah, so in some sense, like when there's something that's broken, there's an opportunity for intervention. I also just want to quickly say that, the twin studies don't get you away from this problem that I just described because you are controlling for genetic being genetically identical in an environment that is already highly constrained. So you are not putting people, one of those kids, in a hunter-gatherer group, and another kid in an industrialized society. You're putting people in roughly similar environments. So you're still kind of holding environment constant, or reducing it significantly. So the genes, you're setting it up so the genes have every possibility to do the predictive work rather than the environment because they're largely the same. They're largely the same. The differences in our society are not as large as the differences over time through history, nor across societies on the globe. So
I know
that's
we're
it.
getting
That's
close to a time where we probably need to stop. Let me come back and push it a little bit harder on this.
yeah.
The point of the physical attractiveness example, I mean, even the way you came back, yes, of course, physical attractiveness can be a marker for lots of things. I mean, if you look at things like just the probability of having children and, the harmonic mean of a whole bunch of bodies that ends up being the physical attractiveness or of a face or whatever, there's lots of evidence that this may be linked to things that are
Sure. Yeah.
genetically evolved for reasons that have to do with real consequences that go back over a long, long way. And you mentioned some that were also having to do with even with the ontogenetic history of a child, for example, with poverty or things. However, the experimental analysis,
Yeah. It removes that. Yeah, I know. That's why I want to read it. It sounds so interesting.
it pulls it out. And there I look at the cultural evolutionists, and so did David Sloan Wilson. That's one reason that book is over my shoulder.
Yeah.
And with a little bit of, with pause, things that make you go, because why wouldn't we have a robust experimental analysis of culture in the very sciences that study it?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
When it partitions exactly what you're talking about between the make and break, for example, and yeah, it's a complex system, but if you can change it and it changes, that's
Hmm.
important. And it's important to policymakers who, after all, are asking people like
Hmm.
yourself, what should we do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the ability to promise that is so much better if we've actually done something like that. Maybe not at that scale, but in micro experiments and all that kind of stuff, and we do it with things like nudge, et cetera. There's some, it's based on some experimental science, but it's frustrating when I'll sound like I'm criticizing, but the recent society that formed around cultural evolution that David helped start, one of the first decisions they made on the board is they won't get into cultural change. They're not going to
Hmm.
deliberately. Why? Because people are terrified that the scientists are going to come in and tell them what to do. And
Yeah.
in the history of science, sometimes we made very bad mistakes. I mean, eugenics was a cultural experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it turned into a horror. But
Yeah.
67% of the presidents of APA from 1892 to 1947 were
It was a
card-carrying
progressive
eugenicists.
movement on how to improve, people.
Yeah, it was considered a progressive movement, and it turned into a nightmare.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
great
Season.
aunts and uncles who didn't make it out because of that. They died in ovens.
Yeah.
But so I understand why the caution on the one hand. On the
Yeah.
other hand, boy, speaking as a interventionist and as a clinical psychologist and as somebody who's trying to change human lives all the time, wouldn't it be cool if we really had a robust experimental analysis of
Yeah.
culture?
Yeah, I mean, listen, speaking personally, I'm not a fan of compelling people to do things, but I'm fine with convincing people and giving them models, options, offering them, greater freedom to do what I think they would choose. It's the same with nudging, right? Like you retain options. You're just trying to not create sludges where you're offering people what they want anyway. You're making it easier for them in some sense. If the default is against their interests, then it's a sludge. If you're putting the candy bars in front and not the fruit, or people don't want to eat fruit, then actually you're working against their interests. I mean, I think we have kind of engineered in some sense a better world. I mean, have you ever been in like a physical altercation in school? And when you were in school?
Absolutely, yeah, of course.
I asked and by the time I was in school, that had kind of died down. But I mean, I definitely got in scraps, right? But you ask all the students these days, it rarely happens. I know you see it on, TikTok or, Twitter when it occasionally does, and certainly some places worse than others. But we have really done an amazing job in reducing the trauma of bullying that many kids face, right?
Yeah.
We've reduced the stigma of of treating people badly because they're less attractive or they have some physical disability or whatever the case may be. And I think these are all examples of leading to people leading better lives. And I think one of the messages I think in the book, there's a few, but one of the messages is you want other people to be better off. I sometimes think, imagine if we didn't have the Marshall Plan, or imagine if Germany didn't develop, right? Now we're rooting for the Germans, like the Germans are going to help, secure the continent. Like it must be nice for them. They're on the right side. And I think, imagine if post Cold War we'd been able to do something with Russia, right? Like where we'd improve the situation for the Russian people. If you help develop countries south of the border in your case, let's say in North Africa, in the case of Europe, fewer people wanna cross illegally into yours,
Yeah.
right? And that applies at every scale. It's that alignment story that I was describing earlier, right? You want people to lead good lives, better lives,
Yeah.
because it's easier to be nice when there's more to go around. The nicest communities you will find are the ones where there's plenty.
Yeah, maybe that's a good place to stop, Michael, because that one world view that we're all in this together. If there's anything that's happened over the last 20, 30 years, is people are waking up to that.
Mm,
If the climate change issue or the immigration issue or the economic disparities issue, or you just name it,
yeah.
you ain't going to be able to run from it. There's not maybe if Elon really succeeds, we can run to Mars, but it's pretty limited places
We'll,
to
we'll,
run
we
right
will,
now.
if we don't solve the central problems, we'll take our problems with us. I
Yeah.
mean, I think something like fusion or something that could be a real game changer, but yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think it'll be very, very cool to see what happens as people become aware of what the cultural evolutionists are even talking about, people like yourself, and what some of the people like myself who, work on intervention from morning to night and have a lot of people do that. Can we hook that up? Because in some important way, we're evolving a culture when we change even a single person. The friends of their friends of their friends of their friends are going to be influenced. That's a fact.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and when you move up into applying those principles to families and to organizations and to neighborhoods and kind of the way that David Sloan Wilson has, and you'll meet a number of people there in Buenos Aires of people who are trying, especially frankly in South America, if I can say, because they have a real challenge there socially and they have a history that psychology should be part of the solution
Yeah,
and of trying different things in the
yeah.
favelas or in the slums and so forth. And maybe there'll be some important points of contact between what
Interesting
you're
things going
talking
on
about.
in Argentina.
It's going to be fun. And so, speaking of fun, that was fun. And thank you so much for just having a conversation with me, Michael. Best of luck with the book to remind people
Thank you
there
very
is.
much.
But can I ask the people at the very beginning, are those your children
Here's
that
the
you
UK
did?
cover, and you can tell me which one you prefer.
You dedicated the book to Robert and Alexandra and Gabrielle. Is those your kids?
Those are my kids. Yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah, well, it was a sweet dedication. I hope that they'll use this to grow up in a better world, and isn't that what we're about?
make the world a better place than they found it. If I could spread one little cultural trait, that would be it.
Awesome.
All right.
Look
Thank you
forward
so
to
much.
seeing
I
you
really enjoyed
there.
this.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your time.
See you in Buenos Aires. Bye.